can't remember how old I was. I was relatively young. I know I was older than 10 years old, but the first time that I heard, or maybe I should say, when I learned the song, Have You Seen Jesus My Lord? I remember the place. It was at Crowley's Ridge Youth Camp, and we had made about a 2.5 mile trek away from the camp, down the creek, all the way to a place called Clay Mountain. It was maybe a little taller than the ceiling, but we called it Clay Mountain. But it was a place where we would every year enjoy that trek together. And we made our way to Clay Mountain, where there was, as you might suspect, a lot of clay. And so we would get to play around in that and, whatever, and jump in the creek or, whatever. And so there would always be a moment where we would stop, we'd gather around, and we would sing songs. And I remember that song, and it was always, the trips to Clay Mountain were always later in the day. So the sun was starting to set, especially over the backside of the hill. And you could start to see all of the colors, in a beautiful sunset. And I remember singing that song for the first time and thinking, wow, this is amazing. And as young as I was, I remember the impact that had on me. So Aaron, thank you for leading us in that song tonight. It helps me to think about the reality that the things that we experience in this life, the beauty that we're able to experience, it all points to who Jesus is. Points to the nature of God and His goodness, His kindness. And the beauty that we see all around us speaks to the beauty of God. I love Psalm 19 that tells us that the skies declare God's glory. And we see in that psalm the explanation of how creation shouts out the glory of God, giving us a very physical image of what God is like. He is a beautiful, an almighty, and all-powerful God. In our progression through Luke's account of the gospel, we've made our way to chapter 20, and tonight, and I appreciate Jaden for reading for us tonight, we're going to get to the last 3 verses of chapter 20, but I want to begin at verse 19. So if you'll back up into Luke 20, verse 19 with me, and I'm not going to read all of it, but I just want to point out a few key elements through the last part of this particular chapter. And so you begin at verse 19, and the text says, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him, on Jesus, at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. And so they watched him, and they sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. Then verse 21, so they asked him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? In Matthew's account, the phrase there, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? That's the question that they bring to Jesus, trying to trap him in his words, finding something that he might say that they could take and accuse him of and present him before the officials. Well, Jesus, in his understanding of their heart, we're told by Luke, it says that he perceived their craftiness. And he said to them, Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? And they said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. It's not seldom in the ministry of Jesus and his experiences with people that he would leave them virtually speechless. These were the religious leaders who were frustrated with what Jesus was doing and really frustrated at some of the claims that not necessarily Jesus was making, but that people about Jesus were making. And there were moments at which they would see Jesus and his teaching and believe that he was blaspheming. And so certainly they would want to arrest him or take him and bring him before the officials. And ultimately, when it's time, when, at least in the words of Jesus as John reveals it to us, when his hour had come, Jesus allowed for them to take him and try him. Remember, it's John chapter 17 where Jesus is praying. In that prayer, he's asking God that his followers would be one. But the prayer is in verse 17, sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. So the very messages that Jesus was presenting, and even the things that he was saying about himself, though limited as they were in fact truth. And if you back up in John's account to chapter 10, where we see Jesus identifying himself as the good shepherd, he tells us that no one's going to take his life from him, but he lays it down of his own accord. And so when his hour had come, they were able to take him and try him in the mock trial and then present him over to be crucified. Well, this moment in the ministry of Jesus is a moment for at least those religious leaders to where they really believed that they were going to be able to put Jesus on the spot and bring him to this point of saying something that they would have the opportunity to arrest him. But we find out there at verse 26 that because of the way Jesus answered, they were all marveling and they became silent. I think in that moment they understood that Jesus and his knowledge and his ability to address questions that were brought before him was beyond their ability. And even though they may have felt that way and it brought them to silence, it did not deter them from seeking out that opportunity. That's why Luke goes on to continue sharing with us in verse 27 and following. It says, then came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection. They asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now here's where they start to really twist the question. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children. And the second and the third took her. And likewise all 7 left no children and died. And afterward the woman also died. In the resurrection, here's the question, whose wife will the woman be? Well, they thought surely this will get him. Verse 34, Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die anymore, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. In verse 37 he says, but that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live in him. And I love verse 39 and 40. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well. For they no longer dared to ask him any question. And so not only does he address the issue regarding Caesar and paying taxes to Caesar, but also now this convoluted question dealing with marriage and whose wife this woman will be in the afterlife. Now keep in mind, they're asking a question about the resurrection, and this is a group of people who don't really believe there's a resurrection. And it's clear, I believe, to Jesus just from the very outset that all they're doing is attempting to trap him. And because of his answer, well, they no longer want to ask him anything else. But I love what Luke continues to record for us. Verse 41. But he said to them, "How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" And so Jesus is responding with a question of his own, one that they don't have an answer for. And that's when we find Jesus continuing. It's verse 45 where it says, "In the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples." Now keep in mind this larger scene that's been taking place really even back in chapter 19, but all the way on into chapter 20, and through this teaching of Jesus and these exchanges back and forth, Jesus says, or Luke reveals to us that in the hearing of all the people, all of them that are gathered around, he says this to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, the places of honor at feasts, and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And so in the midst of this group of religious leaders, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the chief priests who are all gathered around and witnessing these exchanges back and forth between Jesus and them, to find Jesus saying these words to his followers, calling the scribes out, saying, "Beware of them. They live a hypocritical life," Jesus is saying. That moment must have brought silence to the group. I suppose we might even suggest that in our lingo today, if the floor were concrete or wood, it was dirt, so you might not have been able to hear a pin drop, but let's just imagine you could hear a pin drop. It's a powerful teaching from Jesus, one that culminates the experiences that he's had leading up to this point, even some that we saw in our last installment of the series in chapter 19. It's important for us to back up, though. Let's go to chapter 20, verse 1. So as Jesus has had this experience with Zacchaeus at the beginning of chapter 19, we see his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and this is when things begin to get a little more complicated for the religious leaders. Jesus cleanses the temple, and then beginning at verse 1 in chapter 20, here's what Luke records. "One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, 'Tell us, by what authority you do these things, or who is it that gave you this authority?' And he answered them, 'I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?' And they discussed it with one another, saying, 'If we say from heaven, then he'll say, well, why didn't you believe him? But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet.' And so they also answered, and they said to him, or that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus then said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.'" Now, it's easy enough for us to read over that and to maybe miss a nuance of what Luke is trying to do, and maybe more particularly what Jesus is trying to do in this moment. Certainly, we see the heart of the religious leaders. We understand they're trying to trap Jesus, and they want to pose a question to him, and we see it continue to play out. But they want to pose a question to him that they can take and then accuse him and try him and put him to death. They want to get rid of him, and I know we all understand that. And so here this question is that they're asking, "Tell us by what authority you do these things." Well, that is directly tied, I think, to what Jesus has been doing, and particularly what he's doing in the final week of his life. Remember, Luke has just revealed to us that he cleanses the temple. And certainly for them, the temple was a holy place. And who does he think he is coming in and doing what he's doing within this temple area? Well, earlier in the ministry of Jesus, we see John revealing it to us in chapter 2 of John's account of the gospel, where Jesus cleanses the temple. He runs the money changers out. And, Luke tells us that he makes a whip out of cords and he drives them out. And so within that same vein, the questions are raised. Who do you think you are doing this? Well, John tells us that Jesus responds to them, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it again. And John says that Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. Well, they're wondering by what authority or who gave you the authority to do what you're doing. Luke doesn't necessarily give to us the response of Jesus. John helps us to see Jesus' response, though John, while he's not writing in chronological order, John reveals to us that Jesus' response about destroying this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up, Jesus was speaking of his body. They didn't understand that. Their response back in John is, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days? And even in that moment, the temple was not yet complete. And so in Luke's account, Luke is helping us to see that they are extremely frustrated with the things that Jesus is doing and teaching. And so their question centers on why Jesus is doing it and how it is that he thinks he has the right to do it. And Jesus doesn't answer, as Jesus often does in his ministry and in his interactions with people. When asked a question, asks that question in response, a question to which they cannot answer. Well, that leads right into Jesus then teaching the parable of the wicked tenants, which we looked at back a few weeks ago in our Sunday morning series on the stories of the kingdom. Remember, this is the one where a particular vineyard owner let out this vineyard to tenants who came in and they made havoc of it, and he sent and wanted fruit to be given to his servants. And you remember they beat them, and he sends more and they beat them. And he said, I'll send my son. You remember this parable. Well, if you look down at the about verse 16 of chapter 20, it says, this is Jesus responding about what the vineyard owner will do. He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, he says, they said, surely not. Surely not. He wouldn't do that. But verse 17, but he looked directly at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Again, Jesus pointing to himself as the Son who is going to be killed. Well, verse 18, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Well, they are all upset because they perceived that he was telling this parable about them, which in fact he was. And they're upset, and that's where verse 19 comes in. They wanted to lay hands on him, but they didn't. The chief priests, the scribes, they sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable about them, but they feared the people. And so all of this, leading up to those last 3 verses in chapter 20, all of this deals with the conflict that's going on between the religious leaders and Jesus. And it all centers on his authority, and the authority that Jesus understands that he has, and one that they can't quite grasp. And they're asking these questions of him. And so again, in verse 45, in the hearing of all the people, including those with whom he was in conflict verbally back and forth, Jesus said to his disciples, beware of the scribes. Beware of those who walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, the places of honor at feasts, those who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. What Jesus is pointing to is an outward appearance of religiosity, an outward appearance of being holy, when the inside is completely against the will of God. And so Jesus, as they were questioning his authority, Jesus wanted to warn his followers to beware of impure motives. And that's a question for us tonight. What are my motives in the things that I do and the things that I say? What are my motives in my walk with Jesus? There are a few things that I want to mention tonight, and I'll do this rather quickly as we draw our thoughts to a close tonight. But one of the things I think we learn from this is that we need to guard our heart against image-driven religion. We need to guard against going through the motions of our faith so as to look holy to the people around us. We need to make sure we understand what Jesus exposes here. He exposes the scribes because they look holy, yes, but inside they were hollow. And so we don't need to become more committed to appearing spiritual than actually walking with God. That's the call. We are called to walk with God, and we need to make sure that our private obedience matters, to understand that it matters more than a public impression. And sometimes we have a tendency to want to play the part, and in reality, our heart is far from Him. That's the very thing Jesus was exposing here. I would say, too, we need to practice humility in every environment. It doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what position we're in. It matters about the kind of humility that we express in our life. And humility requires me putting myself in the proper place. Not in the place of God, but in one who is falling short of the glory of God and understands that it's only because of His grace that we are who we are. The scribes sought those greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats and on as Jesus expresses it here. But we don't need to seek the spotlight to be faithful. He calls us to be faithful first. And we need to make sure that we are striving for faithfulness in our walk with God. We need to choose that posture of a servant in our conversations, in our leadership, in our ministry, and in our daily life. Living that humble life that Christ exemplified for us. And I would say, too, we need to treat people as image bearers, not as opportunities. That's what we see Jesus exposing here with the scribes. They were looking for opportunities to exploit people. And He condemns their exploitation of people when He says, devouring widows' houses. They were preying on those that were vulnerable. And we need to never use people to build our platform. We need to make sure that we are using the platform that we have to verbalize our faith, to help other people to grow in their faith, to bless other people in life, sharing with others what God has done for us. We need to make sure our influence is being leveraged for compassion and for protection as well as for justice, as we spoke about this morning. And I would say, too, quickly, that we need to remember that God sees motives, not just actions. He sees motives, not just actions. So, take, for instance, Jonah. And we remember the story of Jonah. We learn it as kids in our Bible classes. And the reality of Jonah is that, yes, Jonah in his actions were against what God had called him to. And so it's very easy for us to say, well, yeah, sure, God saw him going in the opposite direction. But the intent of his heart was not what God wanted him to have, even to the point of him saying, okay, I'll go. And once he goes, you remember he speaks as few of words as possible to get the message of God across to the people of Nineveh. And then he's angry with God because God relents when they repent. I think for us, we need to make sure that we understand God sees our heart. He sees our motives. He's not just looking at the outward appearance, but He sees our heart. We need to ask God to help us as we serve, as we give, as we pray, and as we lead, to help us do all of those from a posture of sincerity, not a posture of performance. You see, hidden motives matter to Him, and they ought to matter to us as well. We need to make sure that we are pure in heart as we're accomplishing what God calls us to. And I would say also, we need to be aware of spiritual hypocrisy in our own life. This takes a great deal of reflection, but certainly we see this being taught here in this section as Jesus is exposing the spiritual hypocrisy of the scribes, particularly. You know, Jesus, in one of his strongest warnings here, warns not necessarily against an outside enemy, but rather against a type of enemy that comes from within. Making sure that our motives are right, that our spiritual walk is pure in the eyes of God, striving to follow Him with all His strength within us. We need to make sure to let this passage push us towards self-examination. I would say, too, that we need to honor the vulnerable instead of exploiting them, but we need to take Jesus' warnings seriously. When Jesus warns His followers here in this section, in the last part of chapter 20, in verses 45 through 47, when He warns them, we need to take that to heart today. Jesus said they will have or receive the greater condemnation. And that's not just to them, but that's to us also if our motives and if our heart are not right with God. God holds spiritual leadership to a higher standard. And so if you are an influencer, if you are someone who is a leader, and all of us are, there are people who look up to us. And so in that vein, we need to make sure that, again, if we're a parent, if you're an elder, if you're a deacon, if you're a minister, if you're a teacher, you need to make sure that you embrace accountability for your actions. Embrace integrity in your walk with God and with Christ. And understand that this warning of Jesus is a serious warning to His followers. Beware of the scribes. Not them as individuals, but them in their actions and in their motives. Beware of them. Don't have that kind of attitude. Don't be that kind of person who outwardly wants to appear holy, but inwardly are spiritually a hypocrite. It's hard for us in our walk with God to make sure that we are continually reflecting on our own actions. But that's what's required. And so I want to challenge us all. Let this reality of the teaching of Jesus in this last week of His life, when He's exposing all of this spiritual jujitsu that the scribes and the Sadducees and the chief priests are going through, and make sure that we are not living that way ourselves, holding ourselves accountable, holding one another accountable, making sure we're living with integrity in our heart. If you're struggling to do that, maybe you've been going through those motions and it seems that you fall in line with where the scribes are that Jesus is exposing. If that's where you find yourself tonight, you don't necessarily have to come forward, but I want you to commit yourself to God and ask God to restore you, to restore your spirit and your heart and your passion for following His will from a pure heart and pure motives. Maybe you're not a Christian tonight, but you want to respond to that invitation, confess your faith in Him, and become a Christian tonight. If we can help you with that, if we can pray for you in any way, please come while we stand together and sing.